The room shifted. They waited. For the first time, no one interrupted. I didn't launch into an explanation, I didn't list errors or accuse anyone of negligence. I simply reached into my bag and placed a folder on the table. Inside was nothing new, only what they had already seen before, organized differently, clearly, chronologically, without assumptions filling in the gaps. I slid it across the table and said nothing more. That silence felt different from all the others. This one had weight. The folder stayed on the table longer than I expected. No one reached for it right away. My brothers stared at it as if touching it might somehow make things worse. My mother folded her hands together, her eyes moving between my father and me. My father finally picked it up, slowly, like he was bracing himself for something he hadn't planned on confronting. He didn't read everything at once. He scanned a page, flipped to another, went back. His brow tightened, not in anger but in concentration, the kind of focus I'd only seen when he realized he might have been wrong about something important. My brother tried to fill the silence. He started explaining how things had just evolved that way, how no one had meant for it to get so complicated, how it was all being blown out of proportion. His voice was confident at first, then rushed, then defensive. My father raised a hand. That stopped him. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't tension, it was attention. My father asked me one question, just one. When did you notice this? I told him the truth, that I'd noticed pieces of it years ago, that I'd looked more closely when I was asked to help, that nothing in the folder was new information, it was simply organized. He nodded slowly. My brother laughed once nervously and said, "Why didn't you just say something?" I met his eyes and answered calmly, "Because no one wanted to hear it until now." That landed harder than I expected. My mother inhaled sharply, then exhaled, as if something she'd been holding for a long time had finally found a place to go. She didn't say anything, but she looked at me differently, not with surprise, with recognition. The conversation that followed wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations, no shouting, just questions, clarifications, long pauses where assumptions were quietly dismantled. Every time my brother tried to hurry ahead, my father slowed him down, asked him to point to specifics, to explain reasoning, to justify decisions that had never been questioned before. And every time, the answers came up short. I didn't say much after that. I didn't need to. The folder did the work for me. The structure spoke. The gaps became obvious without commentary. At one point, my father leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. He looked tired, but not angry, more like someone realizing they'd been navigating with an outdated map. "We need to rethink this," he said finally. "Not fix, not salvage. Rethink." That was the moment I knew the shift was permanent. The meeting ended without resolution, but not without direction. Decisions were postponed, responsibilities reassigned, and for the first time, I was asked explicitly to be a part of the process moving forward, not as support, as input. When everyone left the room, my brother lingered. He looked uncomfortable, unsure of how to position himself now that the ground had moved. "I didn't know," he said. I believed him. I also knew it didn't change anything. "I know," I replied, and that was all. In the weeks that followed, the family dynamic adjusted in small, telling ways. Conversations slowed. People listened longer before responding. Decisions came with questions instead of declarations. No one suddenly treated me like an authority figure. That wasn't the point. They treated me like a participant. My brother stopped making jokes about things he didn't understand. My father started asking my opinion before finalizing plans, not after. My mother stopped smoothing things over and allowed discomfort to exist long enough for honesty to take shape. There was no apology tour, no emotional reckoning, just a quiet recalibration. And it worked. What surprised me most was how light everything felt once I stopped shrinking. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt aligned, like I no longer had to choose between peace and presence. For years, I'd believed that not using my rank at home was a sign of humility, and in some ways it was. but I'd also used that belief to justify disappearing when it mattered. There's a difference between restraint and erasure. I had finally learned where that line was. Just before this story reaches its end, let me say this. If you're still listening and believe that patience, when used intentionally, can change outcomes, take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach people who might need to hear them. The real payoff wasn't the meeting, the folder, or even the shift in how my family treated me. It was internal. I stopped waiting for permission to occupy space. I stopped assuming that being calm meant being invisible. I realized that my rank was never the source of my authority. It was simply evidence of skills I already had, skills that belonged to me whether I wore a uniform or not. Today, I still don't use my rank at home. I don't need to. What I use is clarity, presence, and the confidence that comes from knowing I don't have to announce my worth for it to be real. If you've ever been underestimated, not because you lacked ability, but because you chose patience, I hope this story resonates with you. Silence can be powerful only when it's a choice, not a habit. And if you want to hear more stories about quiet strength, delayed clarity, and outcomes that feel inevitable rather than explosive, subscribe and stay. Some of the most meaningful changes happen without noise when the timing is finally right. The room went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not awkward quiet, not polite quiet. This was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes people suddenly aware of their own breathing. My brother stopped mid-sentence. My mother's smile froze, half-formed. My father lowered his glass and stared at the document in his hands as if it had changed language while he was reading it. No one looked at me. They all looked at the paper. That was the moment my family finally understood that my rank had never been invisible. I had simply never used it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that morning unfolded the way it did, you need to know how carefully I learned to stay quiet and how long my family mistook restraint for irrelevance. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 45 years old. I've spent most of my adult life in uniform, not the kind people notice at airports or thank loudly in restaurants, the kind that blends into procedure, into systems, into responsibility. At work, I was trusted with decisions that couldn't be undone easily, with people who depended on clarity, not charisma, with outcomes that mattered whether anyone applauded or not. At home, none of that seemed to count. I grew up in a family that valued confidence above competence. My father believed the loudest voice usually had the best ideas. My older brother inherited that belief without ever questioning it. My mother learned to smooth things over, to keep everyone comfortable even when comfort came at the cost of honesty. When I joined the service in my 20s, my family treated it like an extended detour, something I'd eventually grow out of. They were supportive in theory, dismissive in practice. They asked when I was coming back. They asked what my real plan was. They never asked what I actually did. I didn't correct them. When I came home on leave, I dressed down. I listened. I avoided talking about work unless asked directly, and even then, I kept it vague. I told myself I was protecting the boundary between my professional life and my personal one. Over time, that boundary became something else: silence. Years passed. Promotions came and went. Responsibilities increased. At home, the dynamic stayed exactly the same. Family decisions were made without consulting me. My brother spoke for me in group conversations. My father offered advice I hadn't asked for, often about things he didn't understand. When I disagreed, it was brushed aside gently, as if I were being sensitive. When I stayed quiet, it was taken as agreement. It wasn't malicious. That almost made it worse. The first real shift came during a holiday gathering a few years ago. My brother joked about how I was still playing soldier while he was handling real life. Everyone laughed. I smiled and let it pass. Later that night, my mother pulled me aside and asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. And I was, because by then I had learned something important. Reacting would only reinforce the version of me they already believed in. At work, we called it strategic patience. Knowing when not to move was just as important as knowing when to act. At home, I practiced it without even realizing I was doing so. The injustice didn't escalate all at once. It came in small, almost reasonable steps. I was expected to contribute financially without being included in discussions. I was assigned responsibilities at family events without being asked. My opinions were summarized by others before I had a chance to speak. Once, during a dinner with extended relatives, my brother interrupted me mid-sentence and finished my thought incorrectly. When I corrected him, he laughed and said, "You know what I mean." Everyone nodded. I stopped trying to clarify. That was when the humiliation stopped feeling personal and started feeling structural. I wasn't being ignored because of who I was being ignored because of the role I'd been assigned, and I had helped assign it. The hidden advantage I had wasn't dramatic. There was no secret plan, no file tucked away in a drawer. It was access. Access to information, to processes, to the way decisions actually get made when optics don't matter. And more importantly, access to my own restraint. I didn't confront my family. I didn't demand respect. I didn't explain myself. I observed. I noticed patterns. Who spoke first? Who deferred? Who decided and who executed? And I noticed something else. They weren't threatened by me because they didn't believe I could challenge them. That belief gave me time. The turning point came wrapped in practicality. My parents decided it was time to reorganize some long-standing family matters, financial documents, legal arrangements, nothing urgent, but important enough that my father wanted to handle it properly. He asked my brother to coordinate everything. My brother asked me to help with logistics. Not input, not decisions, logistics. I agreed. Over the next few weeks, I quietly reviewed documents I was given, not because I was suspicious, but because it was habit. Accuracy mattered to me. And I noticed inconsistencies. Nothing illegal, nothing alarming, just assumptions that hadn't been questioned, decisions made years ago that no longer made sense, responsibilities assigned without clarity. When I raised a question, my brother waved it off. "Dad already decided. It's fine," he said. I let it go. I started keeping notes, not to expose anything, to understand it. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one who noticed things others overlooked, tell me where you're listening from. I read every comment. As the date for a final meeting approached, the tension in the family grew. Old disagreements resurfaced. My father grew defensive. My brother became more dismissive. At one point, my brother told me I was overstepping, that I should just help and not complicate things. I apologized. That surprised him. I stepped back visibly, let them move forward without my input, let them believe I had surrendered whatever influence I might have had. Behind the scenes, I prepared for something else. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning. Everyone would be there. Documents printed, decisions finalized. I arrived early, sat quietly, listened as the conversation unfolded exactly as I expected. My brother spoke confidently. My father nodded along. My mother tried to mediate when voices rose. At one point, my father picked up a document and frowned. He asked where a particular decision had come from. My brother shrugged. That's how it's always been. That was when I spoke. Not loudly, not sharply. I said, that decision was provisional. It was never meant to be permanent. They all turned to me. My father asked how I knew that. I handed him a folder. Inside were copies of documents he himself had signed years earlier, annotated, cross-referenced, organized. Not new information, just forgotten. He read silently. The room changed. My brother tried to explain, tried to justify, but his confidence faltered as my father continued reading. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. Just before the moment fully landed, let me say this. If you've been listening and you appreciate stories where patience does the heavy lifting, take a second to like the video. It helps these stories reach the right people. My father finally looked up. He asked me why I hadn't mentioned any of this earlier. I told him the truth, because no one had asked. That answer settled over the room in a way no accusation ever could. The decisions were postponed, then revised, then corrected. No one apologized out loud. They didn't have to. The real payoff wasn't that morning. It was what followed. My brother stopped speaking for me. My father started asking questions before making decisions. My mother stopped smoothing things over and started listening instead. The family dynamic didn't flip overnight. It recalibrated, slowly, permanently. For the first time, I wasn't the quiet helper in the background. I was part of the conversation. Not because I demanded it, because I stopped disappearing. Today, I still don't use my rank at home. I don't need to. What changed wasn't their perception of my authority, it was my willingness to occupy space. If there's a lesson here, it's not about revenge or proving anyone wrong. It's about understanding that silence can be powerful, but only if it's chosen, and that patience works best when it's paired with clarity. If you want to hear more stories like this about quiet strength and inevitable outcomes, subscribe and stay. Some truths only become visible when you give them time. After years of being underestimated at home, the strangest part wasn't the disrespect itself, it was how ordinary it felt. Familiar, almost predictable. My family had settled into a rhythm where my silence filled the spaces they didn't want to examine too closely, and I played my part without protest. I didn't do it because I was afraid of conflict. I did it because conflict, when mishandled, hardens people into versions of themselves that are impossible to reach. I had seen that happen too many times at work. I knew what premature confrontation looked like, and I knew how rarely it led to lasting change. So I waited. At family gatherings, I listened while decisions were made about things that affected me directly. When plans were announced without consultation, I adjusted quietly. When jokes were made at my expense, I smiled and let them pass. Not because they didn't sting, but because reacting would have turned the focus onto my emotions instead of their behavior. My family was comfortable believing I didn't mind. That belief made everything easier for them. The irony was that the same traits they dismissed at home, my calm, my patience, my attention to detail, were the reasons I was trusted with increasing responsibility elsewhere. At work, people depended on me not to react impulsively, not to take things personally, not to let ego interfere with judgment. At home, those same qualities were mistaken for passivity. The gap between those two realities grew wider each year. It became most obvious during moments of stress. When something went wrong, my brother grew louder, my father doubled down, my mother rushed to smooth over whatever tension appeared, and I stayed quiet, observing how quickly volume replaced reasoning. I learned a lot during those moments, not just about them, but about myself. I learned how much I was capable of enduring without resentment, and where that endurance began to blur into self-erasure. The first time I considered speaking up seriously was during a disagreement about finances. It wasn't dramatic, just complicated enough that assumptions mattered. I offered a suggestion, carefully, based on experience. My brother waved it off immediately. My father said, "Let's not overthink this." That was the moment I realized something important. They weren't dismissing my ideas because they disagreed with them. They were dismissing them because they didn't expect me to have them. I withdrew again, but this time it was deliberate. I stopped offering suggestions entirely. I responded when asked, but only with exactly what was requested. No more, no less. I let the consequences of their decisions play out without interference. It wasn't easy. There were moments when stepping in would have saved time, money, or frustration, but I knew that rescuing them would only reinforce the belief that my role was support, not substance. At work, we called this allowing the system to reveal itself. Over time, the cost of ignoring details became harder for them to dismiss. Small issues compounded, confusion grew, frustration surfaced, and still no one asked for my input, not until the situation became uncomfortable. That discomfort was my opening, but I didn't rush it. When my brother finally reached out, it wasn't with an apology or an acknowledgement. It was with a request framed as necessity. He needed help sorting through documents, timelines, and decisions that had accumulated without structure. I agreed, without comment. As I worked through what I was given, I noticed how much had been assumed and how little had been verified. Decisions made in good faith years earlier had never been revisited. Temporary solutions had quietly become permanent ones. Responsibilities were misaligned, not out of malice, but neglect. I documented everything, not to expose anyone, not to prove a point, to understand the full picture. The more I organized, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't competence, it was confidence unchecked by review. My family had trusted momentum more than accuracy, and momentum had carried them further than they realized. I didn't share my observations right away. I waited to see how the conversation evolved. When questions arose, they were directed at my brother. When uncertainty surfaced, it was brushed aside. When doubt appeared, it was reframed as inconvenience. I stayed quiet. That silence was no longer about avoidance, it was about timing. There's a moment in any prolonged misunderstanding when explaining becomes less effective than showing. I was approaching that moment, and I knew it couldn't be forced. Before I go further, let me ask you something. If you've ever held back not because you didn't know the answer, but because you knew it wasn't the right time to speak, I'd love to know where you're listening from. As the scheduled family meeting approached, the atmosphere grew tense. Voices rose easier. Frustrations spilled over into unrelated conversations. My brother became defensive. My father became rigid. And still, no one asked me what I thought. That was when I knew the illusion of control was about to crack. In the days leading up to the meeting, I stepped back visibly. I declined to review drafts. I stopped offering logistical help. I made myself less present, not out of spite, but to allow the process to unfold without my quiet corrections. To them, it looked like surrender. To me, it felt like alignment. On the morning of the meeting, I arrived early and took a seat away from the center of the room. I listened as familiar patterns replayed themselves: assertions without evidence, confidence without clarity, agreement built on habit rather than understanding. When confusion surfaced, my brother spoke louder. When doubt appeared, my father dismissed it. The conversation circled without resolving anything. That was when I knew the question would come. Not directly, not respectfully, almost accidentally. "Didn't you look at this already?" my father asked, glancing in my direction. I nodded. "And?" he pressed. I paused, just long enough to be deliberate. Then I said, "Yes, I did."